I never imagined that a simple patch of earth in my own backyard, a place designed for my son's peace, would become a battlefield, but that's exactly what happened. It all started because my son, Leo, experiences the world differently than most of us. He's autistic, and a big part of that for him is a sensory processing disorder that can turn a gentle breeze into a hurricane of sensation or the hum of a refrigerator into a deafening roar. My business is landscaping, shaping the earth to create beauty and function, so when his pediatrician suggested a sensory garden might help ground him, it felt like the most natural thing in the world for me to build one. It was a project born of love, a father's attempt to give his son a small, quiet corner of the world where things made sense. We lived in a subdivision called Oak Creek Estates, a name that promised a certain kind of tranquil, suburban life. For the first few years, it delivered. The houses were nice, the lawns were green, and the homeowners association was mostly a phantom entity that collected a modest fee once a year to maintain the little park at the entrance. It was a place where people waved as they got their mail, where kids rode bikes in the street until dusk. My wife and I had bought our house there specifically for that feeling of quiet stability, a good place to raise Leo. I ran my landscaping company from a small office attached to our garage, and life was orderly, predictable, and calm. I liked it that way. I'm a man who prefers routine over drama, a clean edge on a lawn over a messy argument. The calm began to curdle about a year before the garden incident, and it started with the arrival of a woman named Carol Peterson. She and her husband bought the corner house on the main loop, a prime spot that seemed to feed her sense of importance. Carol was one of those people who seemed perpetually wound tight, her thin lips always pressed into a line of faint disapproval. She had a way of looking at your yard not as a personal space, but as a potential violation. Within 6 months of moving in, she'd somehow maneuvered her way onto the HOA board, and 3 months after that, she was its president. The previous president, a retired accountant named George, had been happy to hand over the reins. He later told me he was tired of the paperwork. I think he was just tired of Carol. Her reign began subtly. First came the newsletters, professionally printed and full of new rules and reminders of old ones nobody had ever enforced. Mailboxes had to be a specific shade of black, Model 7B from a particular manufacturer. Holiday decorations could not be erected before the day after Thanksgiving and had to be removed by January 2nd, without exception. Garbage cans could not be visible from the street except on collection day itself, between the hours of 5 in the morning and 7 in the evening. Each new rule was presented as a necessary step to protect our property values and maintain community standards. A low grumble went through the neighborhood, but for the most part, people complied. It was easier than fighting. It was just a mailbox, just a few Christmas lights. We were all busy with our own lives, and the path of least resistance was to simply paint the mailbox and take the wreath down on time. We were tolerating it, just as you might tolerate a persistent buzzing fly, hoping it would eventually go away on its own. It didn't. Leo's world, meanwhile, was getting smaller. At 7 years old, he was struggling more than ever. The noise of the school bus, the unpredictable chaos of the playground, the bright fluorescent lights of the classroom, it was all becoming too much. He was having more meltdowns, retreating further into himself. Dr. Evans, his pediatrician, was a kind woman with gentle eyes who had seen him since he was a baby. At a particularly difficult appointment, she sat with us, looking at a report from Leo's occupational therapist. "He needs a safe space," she said, her voice soft but firm. "A place where the sensory input is predictable and calming. Have you ever considered a sensory garden?" She explained the concept. A space designed to engage the senses in a gentle, therapeutic way. Plants with soft, fuzzy leaves to touch, like lamb's ear. A small, bubbling water feature for soothing sound. Fragrant herbs like lavender and mint for smell. A variety of colors and textures, but arranged in an orderly, non-overwhelming way. For me, a man who spent his days wrestling with soil and stone, it was more than just a good idea, it was a calling. It was something I could build with my own 2 hands to help my son. I could create that safe space for him, a tangible expression of my love and a shield against a world that was often too loud and too sharp for him. I spent weeks planning it. I sketched out designs, researched plants, and sourced materials. I chose a corner of our backyard that was partially shaded by a large oak tree. It was our property, well within our fence line, and not visible from the street. I was meticulous, using the same professional care I would for any of my high-paying clients. I built a low, curving stone wall to define the space. I laid a winding path of smooth, flat river stones. I installed a small, self-contained fountain that produced a gentle burbling, not a splash. I planted soft mosses, fragrant herbs, and plants with interesting textures. Leo watched me from the kitchen window every day, his small face pressed against the glass, a quiet observer to the construction of his new sanctuary. I was about halfway through the project, kneeling in the dirt and carefully placing a patch of Irish moss between two stones, when a shadow fell over me. I looked up, squinting into the afternoon sun, and saw Carol Peterson standing on my lawn, just inside the open gate of my backyard fence. She was wearing crisp white capri pants and a polo shirt, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was one of deep and profound offense, as if she'd just discovered a toxic waste dump instead of a garden. "What is all this?" she asked. It wasn't a question so much as an accusation. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the peaceful sound of the birds and my small fountain. I got to my feet, wiping my hands on my jeans. I'm not a small man, but Carol had a way of making you feel like you were being looked down upon. "It's a garden," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "For my son." "A garden," she repeated, her eyes scanning the area with disdain. She took a step closer, her sensible white sneakers leaving an imprint on the new sod I'd laid a month prior. "I don't recall seeing an architectural review committee application for this structure." She gestured vaguely at the low stone wall. I was taken aback. "It's a retaining wall," I corrected her gently. "It's less than a foot high. It's landscaping." I didn't think I needed an application for planting some flowers in my own backyard. "Anything involving hardscaping, as you should know from your profession," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "requires prior written approval from the committee." Which, as you know, I chaired. Her smile was thin and triumphant. "This is unapproved landscaping. It violates Section 7, subsection C, of the Community Covenants. No alteration to the exterior landscape, including but not limited to the erection of fences, walls, or other permanent structures, shall be made without the express written consent of the Architectural Review Committee." She had recited the rule from memory, a clear sign she had come prepared for this confrontation. I felt a flash of frustration, but I pushed it down. I had to handle this carefully. This wasn't about me, it was about Leo. "Carol, with all due respect, this is a therapeutic garden for my son. He's autistic. His doctor recommended it. It's meant to be a calming space for him." I tried to appeal to her sense of decency, assuming she had one. That was my first mistake. She was completely unmoved. "That is irrelevant," she said flatly. "The rules are the rules. They apply to everyone equally. We can't have people just building whatever they want in their yards. It lowers the aesthetic standard of the entire community." "The aesthetic standard?" I gestured around the carefully planned space. "It's a garden. It's going to be beautiful. And you can't even see it from the street. It impacts no 1 inch." "I can see it," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "I was on my afternoon constitutional, and I saw you from the walking path behind your property. It is an unapproved modification." The walking path was 50 yards away, through a thicket of trees. She must have been actively snooping to have even noticed what I was doing. The realization that she was policing the neighborhood with such vigilance was unsettling. "So what do you want me to do, Carol?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. "I'm halfway through." "You are to cease all work immediately," she commanded. "And you are to restore the yard to its original, approved condition. That means removing this wall, these stones, all of it." I stared at her, dumbfounded. The sheer unreasonableness of the demand was staggering. Restore it? I had spent days of back-breaking work and hundreds of dollars on materials. More importantly, I had made a promise to my son, a silent one, as I built this for him. "I'm not going to do that," I said, my voice low and firm. Her face hardened. "Then you will be in violation. You'll receive a formal notice. The fine is $100 per day until the violation is corrected." She turned on her heel, her posture radiating self-righteous victory. "You should have read the bylaws," she called over her shoulder before marching out of my yard. I stood there for a long time, the trowel still in my hand, the scent of fresh soil in the air. The peaceful sanctuary I was building had been invaded and desecrated by a petty tyrant. The argument wasn't about a wall or a stone path. It was about control. And I had just become the focus of Carol Peterson's insatiable need for it. A formal-looking envelope appeared in my mailbox 2 days later. It was the first official notice of violation, complete with a grainy, zoomed-in photograph of my unfinished garden, taken from the walking path. It cited Section 7C and informed me that a fine of $100 had been levied against my account, with the same amount to be added for each day the unapproved structure remained. My first reaction was a surge of defiant anger. I crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. I went straight back out to the garden and continued my work. I laid the rest of the path stones, my movements sharp and precise. I planted a small patch of lavender next to the wall. Each stone I set, each plant I put in the ground felt like an act of rebellion. This was my home, my property. This was for my son. I would not be bullied into destroying something meant to help him. The next day, another envelope arrived. And the day after that. Carol was being meticulous. Each letter was a stark, white reminder of the battle she was waging against me. After a week, the fines totaled $700. My wife, Sarah, was growing anxious. "Can she really do this?" she asked, her brow furrowed with worry as she looked at the stack of letters on the kitchen counter. "I don't know," I admitted. "It seems insane. It's our backyard," but the letters were official. They cited bylaws. They looked legitimate. The creeping tendrils of doubt began to work their way into my resolve. I decided to try reason one more time. I found Carol's phone number in the HOA directory and called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice clipped and impatient. "Carol Peterson." "Carol, it's Mark, from down the street," I began, trying to keep my tone even and neighborly. "I know who you are," she said coldly. "Are you calling to inform me that you've dismantled the unapproved structure?" "I'm calling to ask you to reconsider," I said, ignoring her jab. "I want to formally request a variance, an exception. My son has a medical need for this garden. I can provide a letter from his pediatrician explaining the therapeutic benefits. The deadline for submitting an architectural review committee application for consideration at the next meeting has passed," she stated flatly. "And variances are only granted for genuine hardships, not for personal projects." "A child's medical and developmental needs aren't a personal project," I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "This is a genuine hardship. We are trying to provide a safe environment for our son. The rules are in place to protect everyone's investment," she retorted, her voice rising. "If I make an exception for you, where does it end? Before you know it, people will be putting up sheds and gazebos and all sorts of unsightly things. There can be no exceptions. Remove the structure, and the fines will stop with that." She hung up. The finality of the click in my ear was like a declaration of war. She had made it clear that there was no room for reason, no possibility of compromise. My son's well-being was an irrelevant detail in the face of her rigid adherence to the rules she now controlled. The fines continued to accumulate. By the end of the second week, I was supposedly $2,000 in debt to the HOA. The garden was finished now, and it was beautiful. Leo had started to venture into it. He would run his small hands over the fuzzy leaves of the lamb's ear plants and sit by the fountain, his eyes focused on the gentle movement of the water. He seemed calmer, more centered. Seeing him there, finding a small measure of peace in the space I had built, strengthened my resolve. I would not tear it down. I started talking to my neighbors, trying to gauge the community's sentiment. Most were sympathetic but wary. "Carol is a real piece of work," said Dave from next door, leaning over our shared fence. "She sent me a violation notice because my hose was called messily." Messily? But I wouldn't cross her, man. She holds grudges. Others told similar stories. A notice for a small oil stain on a driveway. A warning for a child's bicycle left on the lawn overnight. A fine for having the wrong species of oak tree planted in the front yard, a tree that had been there for 10 years before Carol even moved in. She was terrorizing the neighborhood with 1,000 petty tyrannies, but everyone was too intimidated or too busy to fight back. They just paid the small fines, coiled their hoses neatly, and kept their heads down. My case was different. My fines weren't small, and the principle was too important. It was Mr. Henderson who gave me my first glimmer of hope. He was a retired history professor who had lived in Oak Creek Estate since it was first built 30 years ago. He'd seen it all. I found him tending his prize-winning roses one afternoon and explained the situation. He listened patiently, his weathered face thoughtful, his hands never ceasing their gentle pruning. This association was founded to manage the communal property and ensure the neighborhood didn't fall into disrepair, he said, snipping a dead bloom. It was never meant to be a tool for one person's ego. This isn't about a wall, son. It's about power. She enjoys it. He looked me straight in the eye. Don't let her win. Too many people have already surrendered. His words were a balm to my frayed nerves. He was right. This was bigger than my garden. It was about standing up to a bully who had wrapped herself in the flimsy armor of bylaws and regulations. The final straw came a month into the conflict. A certified letter arrived, thicker than the others. It was a notice of intent to file lien. The total amount of the fines, including late fees and administrative charges she had apparently invented, was now over $4,000. The letter stated that if the amount was not paid and the violation not corrected within 30 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property. That was it. This was no longer just a neighborhood squabble. A lien could seriously impact our finances, our ability to sell our home, our future. She was threatening my family's security over a garden. My anger solidified into a cold, hard resolve. She had pushed me into a corner, and now I was going to push back. I picked up the phone and made an appointment with a lawyer. The lawyer's name was David Chen. His office was in a modest building downtown, a place that suggested competence without extravagance. He was younger than I expected, with a sharp, intelligent gaze. I laid out the whole story, spreading the stack of violation notices and the lien threat across his polished desk. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Well," he said, "you've certainly got a classic petty tyrant situation here. I see this a lot with homeowners associations. They can attract a certain personality type. Can she do this?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me for weeks. Can she really put a lien on my house over this? "Legally, yes," he said, and my heart sank. "The covenants you signed when you bought the house are a binding contract. If the HOA follows its own procedures correctly, they can levy fines and place liens to collect them. The question is whether she is following the procedures correctly, and whether the rule itself is being applied reasonably." Reasonably? I scoffed. She wants me to tear down a medically necessary garden for my disabled son because she can barely see it from a walking path 50 yards away. Nothing about this is reasonable. "I agree," David said. "And that's our angle. But fighting this in court based on reasonableness is expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. A judge might just look at the contract and say you're obligated to follow it. We need something more concrete. We need to find out if she's the one violating the rules." He leaned forward, his expression shifting from analytical to strategic. "She's obsessed with the rules, right? People like that often believe the rules don't apply to them in the same way. They get sloppy. I want you to formally request, in writing, copies of several documents from the HOA. You are entitled to them as a homeowner. I want the last 2 years of meeting minutes, the complete and current bylaws, and most importantly, the detailed financial statements. Invoices, receipts, everything. What are we looking for? I asked. Incompetence, hypocrisy, or corruption, he said with a slight smile. With people like this, you can usually find at least one of the three. Look for procedural errors in how she's fining you. Look for evidence of selective enforcement. And comb through the financials. See where the money is going. An HOA is a non-profit corporation. The money is supposed to be spent for the benefit of the community. I left his office feeling a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer just a frustrated homeowner, I was an investigator. I sent a formal, certified letter to the HOA board, as per David's instructions, requesting the documents. Carol couldn't legally refuse. A week later, a thick manila envelope was left on my doorstep. It was filled with printouts, meeting minutes, budget summaries, and a thick sheaf of financial records. For the next several nights, after Leah was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a highlighter and a pot of coffee, poring over the documents. The meeting minutes were a monument to Carol's ego, filled with her pronouncements and decisions, with little recorded dissent from the other 2 board members, who seemed to be little more than her rubber stamps. The bylaws were a labyrinth of convoluted regulations, but I did find a clause about the appeals process that she had conveniently failed to mention in her notices to me. Then I got to the financials. It was mostly what you'd expect: payments for water for the front entrance, sprinklers, insurance, a small fee for the accountant who did their taxes. But one recurring expense caught my eye. There were monthly payments, large ones, to a company called Pristine Lawns LLC. The payments were for common area maintenance. The amount seemed incredibly high. One month it was $3,000. The next, $4,500. I knew what it cost to maintain the small patch of grass and a few flower beds at the neighborhood entrance. My own company could do it for $500 a month, and I'd still be making a healthy profit. These charges were astronomical. Who was this company that was charging 10 times the going rate? My heart started to beat a little faster. This felt like something. I went to my computer and did a state business registry search for Pristine Lawns LLC. The search result popped up instantly. The company was registered as a sole proprietorship. I clicked to see the details of the registered agent, the person legally responsible for the company. The name on the screen made me sit back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. The registered agent was listed as Carol O'Malley. I did a quick social media search. O'Malley was Carol Peterson's maiden name. The address listed for the business wasn't a commercial property, it was a private mail services box in the next town over, the kind people use when they don't want to list a home address. I had her. She had created a shell company under her maiden name and was using it to funnel HOA funds directly into her own pocket. She was wildly overcharging for landscaping services that were likely either done by the cheapest labor she could find or, in some cases, not done at all. She was stealing from her neighbors. She was using our money to finance her petty kingdom. And the irony was beautiful. She was going to be brought down by a landscaper over a landscaping contract. I immediately called David Chen. I could hear the excitement in his voice as I laid out what I had found. "That's it," he said. "That's the silver bullet. This goes way beyond bylaw violations. This is criminal fraud. Embezzlement. So what's our next move?" I asked, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "We don't go to the police yet," he advised. "That will come. First, we use this to solve your problem and to remove her from power. The annual HOA meeting is next month, right?" "Yes, in 3 weeks." "Perfect," David said. "We're going to prepare. You're going to gather more evidence. Get sworn affidavits from 2 other local landscaping companies with quotes for maintaining the common areas. It will demonstrate just how inflated her company's charges are. And get a formal, written statement from your son's pediatrician about the medical necessity of the garden. We are going to build an airtight case. And you, my friend, are going to present it at that meeting. We are going to give her a public trial. The next 3 weeks were a blur of calculated preparation. I moved from a defensive posture to an offensive one. I felt a newfound confidence, a sense of clarity. The fear and anxiety that had plagued me were replaced by a cold, righteous anger. I was no longer just fighting for my son's garden, I was fighting to expose a corrupt fraud who was preying on her own community. I followed David's instructions to the letter. I contacted 2 reputable landscaping competitors. Without telling them the full story, I asked them to provide detailed, formal quotes for the annual maintenance of the Oak Creek Estate's common areas. As I expected, their quotes came in at around $6,000 and $7,000 for the entire year, respectively. I look back at Carol's invoices from Pristine Lawns LLC. Over the last 12 months, she had billed the HOA for over $40,000. The discrepancy was damning. I also visited Dr. Evans. I explained the situation, and she was appalled. She drafted a powerful, 2-page letter on official letterhead, detailing Leo's condition and the clinical reasoning behind prescribing a sensory garden. She described it not as a landscaping feature but as a piece of therapeutic medical equipment essential for his developmental progress and mental health. She offered to speak to any board member who required further clarification. Her letter was more than I could have hoped for. It was a professional, medical repudiation of Carol's petty classification of the garden. Meanwhile, I started a quiet campaign. I talked to my neighbors again, but this time with a different purpose. I didn't reveal my silver bullet, but I told them I was going to formally challenge Carol's leadership and the recent fines at the annual meeting. I encouraged them to attend. If you're tired of the constant notices and the feeling of being watched, you need to be there, I told them. This is our only chance all year to have our voices heard as a group. Mr. Henderson became my unofficial deputy. He worked the phones, calling the older residents, the ones who remembered the friendly, laid-back neighborhood of the past. He spoke of community and fairness and reminded them that the HOA was supposed to serve the homeowners, not the other way around. My fight had become a rallying cry for all the pent-up frustration in the neighborhood. The day of the annual meeting arrived. It was held in the small, sterile meeting room of the local public library. In previous years, attendance was a joke. Maybe 10 people would show up, mostly the board members and a few retirees with nothing better to do. But tonight, the room was packed. Every chair was filled, and people were standing along the walls. I saw faces I hadn't seen in years. Dave from next door was there. The family with the wrong kind of oak tree was there. The guy with the oil stain on his driveway was there. Mr. Henderson sat in the front row, giving me a firm, encouraging nod. Carol was at the front table, flanked by her 2 silent board members. She looked surprised, then annoyed, by the massive turnout. She clearly wasn't expecting this level of scrutiny. She plowed through the standard agenda items, the reading of the previous minutes, the treasurer's report, her voice tight with irritation at the restless energy in the room. When she presented the budget, she glossed over the grounds maintenance line item, but I saw a few people who I'd spoken to shift in their seats and exchange glances. Finally, she reached the end of the agenda. "Is there any new business?" she asked, her tone making it clear she hoped there was none. This was my moment. I stood up, a file folder in my hand. "Yes," I said, my voice ringing out in the quiet room. "I have some new business." Carol's eyes locked on me, her expression a mixture of contempt and surprise. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "If this is about your delinquent account, this is not the proper forum. You need to address that in writing to the board." "Actually, Carol, this is about the board's delinquent account to the community," I replied calmly. The room went dead silent. I could feel every eye in the room on me. I had their attention. "I'd like to discuss the exorbitant fees being paid for landscaping services." I walked to the front of the room and stood at the podium they had set up for speakers. I opened my folder. I had practiced this speech with David, rehearsed it until the words were second nature. I started by talking about the spirit of our community, about neighborliness and fairness. Then, I moved to the fines. Many of us have been on the receiving end of violation notices for minor issues, I said, looking around the room. I, myself, have been fined over $4,000 for building a therapeutic garden for my autistic son in my own backyard. A murmur went through the crowd. I have here, I said, holding up the letter, a detailed statement from Dr. Evans, a respected pediatrician, explaining that this garden is a medical necessity for my child's health and well-being. But the board, led by President Peterson, dismissed this. They called it an unapproved structure and have threatened to put a lien on my home. I let that sink in. Then I moved to the main event. I was curious about how our HOA fees were being spent. So I looked at the financial records. And I found a consistent, massive overpayment for a single service, grounds maintenance. I held up the invoices. Over the last year, our HOA has paid more than $40,000 to a company called Pristine Lawns LLC for maintaining the small patch of land at our entrance. Another, louder murmur rippled through the audience. People were starting to do the math in their heads. That seems high, doesn't it? I asked rhetorically. So I got professional quotes from two other highly respected local companies. I held them up. Their estimates for the same work? Around $6,000 for the year. So the question is, why are we overpaying by more than $30,000? And who is Pristine Lawns LLC? Carol was turning pale. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the table. This is out of order, she sputtered. You can't just make these wild accusations. I ignored her and delivered the final blow. I did a little research, I said, my voice steady and clear. I looked up the state business registration for Pristine Lawns LLC. And I found that the owner and registered agent of this company is a woman named Carol O'Malley. I paused, then turned to look directly at her. Which, I believe, is your maiden name, isn't it, Carol? The room erupted. It was chaos. People were shouting, pointing at Carol, demanding answers. Her face had gone from pale to a deep, blotchy red. She was stammering, trying to deny it, but her denials were drowned out by the angry voices of her neighbors. It's a legitimate business. The fees are standard. This is a personal attack, she yelled, but no one was listening. Her authority had evaporated in an instant. Her two fellow board members looked utterly horrified. They were slowly pushing their chairs back, physically distancing themselves from her as if she were contagious. Mr. Henderson stood up, his voice cutting through the noise with the authority of age and reason. I believe we have seen enough, he said calmly. I would like to make a motion. I move for an immediate, independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 2 years. I also move that the findings of this audit, along with the evidence presented here tonight by Mr. Miller, be turned over to the District Attorney's Office for a criminal investigation. Second, yelled Dave from next door. Carol screamed, you can't do that. All in favor? Mr. Henderson asked, his voice booming. A forest of hands shot up. It looked like every single person in the room, except for Carol, was in favor. All opposed? He asked. Carol's hand remained on the table, trembling. The motion carries, he declared. It was over. Carol grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room, pushing past the angry homeowners who stood in her way. The spell of fear she had cast over the neighborhood was broken. In her place was a sense of liberation and shared purpose. We had taken our community back. The aftermath of that meeting was swift and decisive. An emergency session of the remaining board members was held the very next day. They, along with Mr. Henderson and myself, formally hired an independent auditor. They also voted unanimously to immediately rescind all fines against my property and to issue a formal, written apology to my family. The threat of the lien was gone. My son's garden was safe. The auditor's report came back 2 weeks later, and it was even more damning than I had imagined. Carol hadn't just been overcharging, she'd been billing for services never rendered. Invoices for aeration and fertilization in the dead of winter. Charges for planting seasonal annuals that no one ever saw. It was brazen, systematic theft. The total amount she had embezzled from the community over her 2-year reign was close to $70,000. Armed with this irrefutable report and my evidence, the board filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office. A criminal investigation was launched. Detectives interviewed me, Mr. Henderson, and several other residents. They subpoenaed Carol's personal bank records and found direct transfers from the Pristine Lawns LLC account to her personal checking account. The case against her was airtight. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Carol's lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony grand theft by embezzlement. The judge was not lenient. He called her actions a disgraceful betrayal of her community's trust. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation, ordered to pay full restitution of the $70,000 to the HOA, and had to complete 2,000 hours of community service. She was also, of course, permanently barred from ever serving on any corporate or non-profit board again. The conviction meant she and her husband had to sell their house, as the restitution payments were crippling. They moved away in the dead of night, their departure as quiet and shameful as their time in our neighborhood had been loud and oppressive. With Carol gone, Oak Creek Estates underwent a renaissance. Mr. Henderson was overwhelmingly elected as the new HOA president at a special election. He, along with a new board of reasonable, community-minded neighbors, immediately set about dismantling Carol's petty regime. They went through the bylaws line by line, striking out the absurd and unenforceable rules. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community building. The HOA started sponsoring neighborhood events, a summer barbecue, a Halloween parade for the kids, a community-wide garage sale. The atmosphere changed completely. People started talking to each other again. The fear was replaced by a sense of camaraderie. We had faced a common enemy and won, and it had forged us into a true community. My reputation, far from being tarnished by the conflict, was solidified. People would stop me on the street or wave from their cars. They called me a hero, which always made me feel a little awkward. I hadn't set out to be a hero. I was just a dad trying to protect his son. A couple of years passed. The neighborhood was thriving. The HOA fees were lowered, yet the common areas looked better than ever, maintained by a legitimate local company at a fair price. Property values, which had stagnated under Carol's reign of terror, began to climb. People were proud to live in Oak Creek Estates again. Leo's garden became a small, beautiful testament to our victory. It was his sanctuary. He spent hours there every day after school, and the change in him was remarkable. He was calmer, more communicative. The meltdowns became rare occurrences. His teachers commented on his improved focus. The garden had given him what Dr. Evans had hoped it would, a predictable, safe corner of the world where he could simply be himself. It had worked. All the stress, all the fighting, had been worth it. One afternoon, I was in a grocery store in the next town over, picking up a few things for dinner. As I rounded the end of an aisle, I saw her. It was Carol. She looked smaller, diminished. Her hair wasn't perfectly coiffed anymore, and she was wearing a faded sweatshirt. She was staring intently at a display of canned beans, her face a mask of weary concentration. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of recognition, then panic, then shame. She quickly looked away, grabbed a random can off the shelf, and hurried down the aisle, her head bowed. She didn't say a word. There was no apology, no confrontation. There was nothing left to say. In that moment, I didn't feel anger or triumph. I just felt a quiet, detached sense of pity. Her obsession with power had cost her everything, and she had been left with a life of quiet disgrace in the canned goods aisle. I often think back on that whole ordeal, usually when I'm sitting on the small stone bench in Leo's garden, watching him carefully trace the veins on a leaf. I learned that petty tyranny can fester anywhere, even in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It thrives on the apathy of good people who are too busy or too intimidated to challenge it. It starts with small rules about mailboxes and garbage cans and grows until it's threatening people's homes and well-being. But I also learned that a community is more powerful than any one person's ego. When people stand together for what is fair and right, they are unstoppable. It takes a catalyst, a person willing to take the first stand and say, "No, this is not acceptable. I never wanted to be that person. I just wanted to be left alone to build a garden for my son." But Carol forced my hand, and in doing so, she inadvertently forced a neighborhood of strangers to become a community of allies. She was the architect of her own downfall, brought down by the very rules she loved to weaponize and the community she so profoundly underestimated. The story ends where it began, in the garden. Leo is 9 now. He's kneeling in the soft dirt, his small fingers gently tending to a patch of mint. A ladybug lands on his finger, and he watches it, his face lit with a pure, unfiltered joy. There is no fear here, no anxiety. There is only the gentle burble of the fountain, the scent of lavender, and the quiet peace of a sanctuary built with love and defended with conviction. I'm back to being just a dad and a landscaper. My days are filled with the familiar rhythms of work and family, of cutting grass and helping with homework. The war is over, and the peace that followed is sweeter than I ever could have imagined. We won.